Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Newsgram. What do convicts, colonial pubs, and one of history's wildest jailbreaks all have in common? Well, settle in, grab yourself a pint, and join me for a trip down under. Before the saloons of the American West, there were the inns of Fremantle, pouring pints, hiding fugitives, and shaping a young colony one pint at a time, literally.
From the very earliest days, the governor at the time had problems with drinking. So our colony had only been going for 6 months and he's already licensed 7 hotels. So we have one of our earliest histories and industries in Western Australia is really its hotels. Being a port, they've always been a very prominent part of the culture of Fremantle life.
That's Alan Graham, a respected historian, an author, and past president of the Fremantle History Society. And until recently, I was unaware of the similarities between the settlement of the Western United States and the settlement of Western Australia. If you go back to the early 1800s, we find that both places were considered the edge of the world, way far from civilization and whatever modern comforts there were at the time. Settlers arrived in both places full of hopes and dreams, only to find unforgiving, untamed wilderness, isolation, and some pretty tough lessons. In the U.S., the West was settled by pioneers, miners, and risk-takers. In Australia, it was colonists, farmers, and convicts. And while Americans were chasing gold in California, Western Australians were digging for it near Kalgoorlie. And while wagon trains crossed the Rockies, ships rolled into Fremantle's port, loaded with dreams and desperation. Indigenous peoples were displaced. Cultural landscapes were altered, and entire regions had to invent new identities from scratch. But through it all, something amazing happened. Communities were born. And at the heart of many of them was the local hotel.
There is a hotel in Fremantle that's now called the Orient Hotel. But in the 1870s, that was a hotel called the Emerald Isle, and it was run by a fellow called Maloney, so he's got Irish connections. But one of the big folklore stories of Western Australia's history is the escape of the Fenians. We had a lot of transported convicts in the 1850s. A lot of them were people from Ireland, but there was a kind of like a plot was hatched. Some of these Irish Fenians were actually smuggled out. They escaped from Fremantle jail on an American whaler called the Catalpa. Now, it was an Irish American that was actually placed himself in Fremantle at this hotel, the Emerald Isle, and was able to steal these 6 Fenians out of Western Australia. So it was a big international event in world history at that time. And those Fenians escaped on this American whaler called the Catalpa and made their way back to Boston. So that's a real standout hotel and a real standout story in Western Australia's history.
He's talking about the escape of the Fremantle Six, and if you've never heard about them, it's worth Googling the term, because their situation is legendary. In fact, Smithsonian Magazine calls the Catalpa rescue an audacious prison break, as elaborate and preposterous as any Ocean's 11 script. Now, let's shift from jailbreaks to buildings, because Alan's book, Ins and Outs of Fremantle, 1829 to 1929, it isn't just a treasure chest of stories. It's a blueprint of how Fremantle's character was built, one inn at a time. He spent 40 years doing research on Fremantle and is compiling a trilogy of books about the area. And I should point out, Inns is spelled I-N-N-S because his book is about not only the development of Western Australia, but the history of those early hotels and how it shaped Fremantle's culture.
Well, it's a port. We've got a fantastic climate. We're a Mediterranean climate. Because we're not very old, we've been able to retain a lot of our heritage buildings. So when you walk through Fremantle, you're walking through a kind of period of time that kind of goes back to colonial times. We're not a town of old buildings. A lot of people who say come from the States to visit us, they say it reminds them of New Orleans with a lot of the sort of architecture. So whereas Perth hasn't been able to retain its heritage buildings, Perth's our capital, Fremantle's the second city in the state, but Fremantle's been able to retain its heritage buildings.
These heritage buildings are where Western Australia's early history was written, and his book explains the role they played in the development of the area's history. He also talks about how the decisions made in these buildings shaped everything from politics to culture, and sometimes even the fate of a nation.
It sort of grew from just one man's ambition to establish a port really on this side of Australia. He gets permission from the home government, so we started in 1829, but the British hadn't really put in the sort of mechanisms and that to run this colony at this time. But because of the way he had sold the colony to the people in England, a lot of people wanted to come out here and start this new township and these two townships, Perth and Fremantle, from scratch.
When we talk about how communities were built in the American West, we often forget that across the ocean, folks in places like Fremantle were doing the same thing. Same grit, same isolation, same fight to survive. The architecture's different, sure, but the spirit, you'd recognize it, especially when it comes to sports.
When Australia won the America's Cup off the Americans in 1983, the challenge for the America's Cup, if your audience know about that, was raced off in Fremantle, and that revitalised Fremantle through that big international event of the America's Cup in 1987.
Yeah, the America's Cup is another event worth looking into a little bit deeper if you don't already know the story. His book is a culmination of 40 years of research and time spent piecing together old papers, tracking down stories long forgotten. This isn't just about digging into the past. It's about revealing an entire history of Fremantle and Western Australia that was basically hidden in plain sight.
The United States have been made up of migrants, settlers, establishing new towns, going through those hardships. If people may not know their own history of their own town, a book like my Fremantle book will actually help them understand. I think it's easy to underrate just how hard these very early settlements of these towns were, whether they're in Australia or in the States, just how much work and how hard it was for those very first settlers in a lot of these towns. And I think that's what I certainly try to show. If, in particular in Fremantle's case, if you were running it as a private business in those 1830s and 1840s, you probably would have thought, we should shut this place down, it's just too hard. We battled for 70 years before we had a big gold strike in the 1890s, which really boosted Fremantle and Western Australia. So that's part of the themes that I'm trying to show in the book, just how difficult those early years were for Fremantle and Western Australia.
At the risk of being redundant, I just want to be clear, this isn't just a fun book about old inns, it's a 40-year deep dive into Western Australia's unsung past. Alan Graham has spent a lifetime connecting the dots, and the result is really something to be treasured, especially if you're a history lover.
But I've really enjoyed it, and I've just found so much history of Fremantle. And I have to sort of say, it's not just the history of Fremantle. You can't just pick a town in isolation and not talk about the wider state of Western Australia. As much as the inns is the emphasis on the hotels, the outs is on other matters about the town and about other matters in the state of Western Australia, about the sort of political hierarchies, the social hierarchies, the culture of drinking, the place of women, the rise of sort of big groups like the Freemasons and the Oddfellows. So there's a whole breadth of Fremantle and Western Australia in this trilogy of books that's much more than just, here's a hotel, here's a story of a publican. It's got a much wider canvas than just shows facts.
Fremantle is currently knocking on the door of its 200th anniversary, and after flipping through this book, I gotta say, it's got me thinking about booking a trip to Western Australia.
Yeah, we're celebrating our 200th anniversary in 2029. 5 years short of that at the moment, so my book meant to be a little bit of a matching that sort of big anniversary date in 2029.
The West isn't just an American state of mind, it's a global spirit. It's rooted in resilience, reinvention, and a few wild nights along the way. Fremantle may have been carved from hardship, but it was built on character, and its heartbeat still echoes through its heritage inns, its weathered bricks, and the stories poured from every tap. Alan Graham's 40-year labor of love is more than a book. It's a passport to the past. And who knows, maybe your next adventure starts with a cold pint at the Sail and Anchor or Ball and Chain, one of the oldest pubs in Fremantle. In fact, let's meet there. Grab a copy of his book. Here's the full title, Ins and Outs of Fremantle, 1829 to 1929, A Social History of Fremantle and Its Hotels by Alan Graham. It'll make a fun read for your plane ride over. It's available now at Amazon.com. Thanks for listening to this edition of Newsgram from WebTalkRadio.com.